chapter 1. You may have noticed that we stopped halfway through day 6 of creation last week, and so we're going to finish that. We don't want to leave it incomplete. And so, one of the interesting things about teaching through Genesis is you come really quickly to really big questions. Questions like, what is the meaning of life? Sort of the quintessential question that we wrestle with, I think, as people is, why am I here? Not just why is everything here, but why am I here? So I did a little research, and I wanted to just see, what do people say the meaning of life is? So my kids might find this fun. Cookie Monster said that the meaning of life is to care about friends, especially friends who love cookies. So Cookie Monster apparently only likes you, maybe not the best kind of friend. Joseph Campbell famously says, life has no meaning. Each of us has meaning and we bring it to life. So life is what you make of it. Tupac tells us to spread more smiles than tears. I might be showing my age. That's from my childhood. We've heard the phrase, live and let live. Is life just a random set of circumstances and we just do with it what we can? No, we find in the story of God's creation that there is purpose to all that is here, and especially to our being here. So we saw last week that God created light and separated it from darkness. He separated the waters in the atmosphere from the waters in the sea. He brought land out of the waters and filled it with vegetation. He created the sun, the moon, and the stars to bear that light for us. He created birds to fill the sky, and fish and all sorts of sea creatures to fill the sea. And then he created animals to fill the land. And then continuing on that sixth day of creation where we pick up, we see that God makes people. And so we're going to talk tonight about what it means to be human. And we're going to look at the blessings of being human. But we can't forget that our understanding of ourselves, like we said the first night in Genesis 1:1, is intimately bound up to our understanding of God. We actually don't really understand our purpose until we understand God's purposes. And this is the problem that atheists have been wrestling with for centuries. And atheists know they have a problem. Some of one of my friends calls these the good atheists, like Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre. These are classic atheists who really took their atheism to its logical extreme. So Sartre said this. He said that atheist problems start with good news. Once you dispense of God, he says, the good news is you can do what you want, guilt-free, no dread of retribution. If you get away with it on earth, you get away with it forever. But the bad news, he says, is when you dispense with God, you lose all intellectual basis for declaring anything to be inherently right or wrong. For something to be right or something to be wrong, you have to have a standard to which you compare it. To say something is against its design, you have to actually know what the design is. So a random universe can't have right and wrong. It just is what it is. So when you're upset that someone treated you unfairly, if you're an atheist, you just get to go, c'est la vie, this is what it is. You might argue, and some have, that it can be useful rather than right or wrong if you're an atheist. So from your vantage point, something might be good for your society or good for in a social contract sort of way. So you might, for example, feel that genocide is wrong. A lot of people feel like genocide is wrong. You'd be surprised how many people born in a different cultural context did not feel that genocide was wrong. The Nazis had a different opinion about genocide. Now, we might say they're wrong from our vantage point, but what gives us the right to say they're not only wrong, but they're evil? That what you're doing is wicked? Is it just what the majority of people say? If it's just what the majority of people say, where does that leave a slave living in the American South in the 19th century before the Civil War? Just because a lot of people agree with it, does that make it right? See, for the atheist, there's no such thing as intrinsic value. Things just are either useful or they're a part of our culture. Now, here's maybe a quote from, if those other guys were our favorite atheists, our least favorite atheists, I call them soundbite atheists, like Richard Dawkins. Here's what Richard Dawkins says about life. He says, when you look at certain scenery, you think it's beautiful because your ancestors believed there was food out there. And that particular neurological feature that helped them survive has now come down to you, and that's the reason you see it as beautiful. So I guess in his mind, when you look at a sunset and it's beautiful, that's because, I don't know, like you love Twinkies or something. I don't understand the connection there. I don't even know how that works. I mean, I guess I could get my wife a card and say, "You are useful for the propagation of my species." I don't think it's going to work, right? I think we understand that the connection there is missing something. That if for an atheist something can't be beautiful in itself, it can only be useful. We know as Christians, we know as God has created that there are things that are good and beautiful because they reflect the image and the handiwork of the Creator. That what makes human beings valuable is intrinsic. It's part of our being. It's built into us. People are not valuable just because they're useful. So here's kind of the big idea from today's sermon. Human beings are uniquely valuable because they bear the image of God and are given the blessing of reflecting God's glory to all of creation. Let me say that again. Human beings are uniquely valuable because they bear the image of God and are given the blessing of reflecting God's glory to all of creation. So let me read our passage for tonight, starting in verse 26 of Genesis 1. Hear the word of the Lord. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. So the first thing we notice just from looking at this whole chapter that we've been studying in Genesis is that the way this passage is set up, we see that humanity is the pinnacle of God's creation. If you were just to count the words on each day of creation, you can see that this day that includes humanity is highlighted, or maybe it's highlit, I can never tell, that's a hard word. It's highlighted by the number of words used just to describe this particular day. More time is spent, more than twice as many words are used on day 6 as even the next closest day. It's like the whole creation account peaks on this particular day. And there's another sort of literary clue that we see when we see that in all these other days, God made. God made the light. God made the land. Here, it says, "Let us." So God didn't make, it says, "Let us make." It switches from "let there be" to "let us make." There's a significance here of God creating man in his image, male and female, creating them and setting them over all of the rest of creation. We even see again at the very end in verse 31, in every other day, it says that God saw it and it was good. But here we see, and God saw it and it was very good. Behold, it was very good. Human beings are the crown of God's handiwork. He's saved the best for last. You know, when you go to a wedding, you don't let the bride walk down the aisle first and then watch all the bridesmaids follow. You know, when you're entering the reception, assuming that the DJ pronounces your last name correctly, you don't let the bride and groom come in first. You save them for last. That's the pinnacle of the day. That's the most important part. So here, the best has been saved for last. So what does this mean? What does this mean about us as human beings? Well, we see that human beings are created, but we're set apart from creation. So we're a part of creation, but we're set at the top of it. We're not the same as animals. We're not just animals, but a little bit more advanced. We're distinct. It's why no matter how much you love your little dog or cat or rabbit or fish, which I think fish as pets are weird. Birds are even weirder, but I apologize. I'm going in another direction. But no matter how much you love your pet, I love my pet. I have a 100-pound dog that too often tries to sleep in my bed. I love my pet. My pet is not a person. The least significant person you can think of is more important than the most important pet. Think about that. See, human beings are made in the image of God. They're a special part of creation. They're set apart at the top. And the whole way that this is written highlights that very fact, while still reminding us that God is the creator. God is still the one that this whole story is about. Humanity is the pinnacle of God's creation. But secondly, we see that humanity is made in the image of God. Humanity is made in the image of God. This is one of the most important theological concepts that we can understand. Theologians use the Latin name Imago Dei. I normally wouldn't say that, but it actually shows up a good amount even on social media and conversations we're having now and again. And so I think it's important that we know that this idea of being made in the image of God is central to how we understand the way God created the world. There's a magnificence to just being human. I think we sometimes forget that because we are that. You know, you get familiar and you're thinking like, there's nothing really special about me. But there is, because God made you in his image. The British crime novelist Agatha Christie said this. She said, "I like living. I have sometimes been wildly, despairingly, acutely miserable, racked with sorrow, but through it all, I still know quite certainly that just to be alive is a grand thing." I think this is wonderfully true. To be a living human being is a grand thing. A pastor friend of mine put it this way. He said, "I am alive. Not like a tree or a rabbit, but like a human being. I am thinking, feeling, longing, regretting, and grieving, alive, made in the very image of God, and this is amazing." In a book I read by John Piper, he was describing how he stays engaged in evangelistic conversations. Right? Have you ever found that when you're trying to share your faith, it can sometimes be difficult because you're trying to think of objections or answer questions? It's actually one of the harder things that we have to do when we share our faith is actually just to listen. And here's what John Piper says. One way that you can be better at sharing your faith is realize the person that you're talking to is made in the image of God. He says this, "Be encouraged that simply finding people interesting and caring about them is a beautiful pathway into their heart. Evangelism gets a bad reputation when we are not really interested in people and don't seem to care about them. People really are interesting. Every person you talk to is an amazing creation of God with 1,000 interesting experiences." C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, "There are no ordinary people because you have never talked to a mere mortal." Think about this. Human beings come into existence. We are created, and then we last forever. Forever. The person you're talking to is not some mere mortal. They are made in the image of God. In my years of being a pastor, I've found one phrase that bothers me a lot, and it happens at funerals, so I can never say anything about it because it's the wrong time. So I have to wait and say something about it now because we're not at a funeral. But people trying to encourage one another, they'll say this phrase. They'll say about their lost loved one, or someone will say to them, "Heaven gained an angel today." I don't know if you know this, that is terribly demeaning. We are not less than angels hoping to become angels when we die. We are human beings made in the image of God. We will join God and judge angels in eternity. The person you are talking to is better than an angel. So let's not bring them down or pretend that being a human being is not enough. God, when he sent his son to die for us, did not send him to become an angel. He sent him to take on flesh and become a human being. So God makes us in the image of God. Before we talk more about what the image of God is, I do want to make this point. I think it is important. It says here that God created man in his own image, verse 27. In the image of God, he created him male and female. He created him. That part of our good and perfect design is that God made us male and female. He did not make some generic uber person. He made us male and he made us female. That it is good for us to be male and female, that there is no generic human being. That men and women are equally made in the image of God, but we are not the same. And that is part of God's design for the family, and that is part of God's design for the church. And I think because the church too often goes with the flow of culture, and we've too often bought into the lies of culture, and we've too often fallen into the traps of culture, especially in our modern era, that we forget that Christianity is the most progressive religion as far as women's rights in the history of humanity. So if you want to go back and study Aristotle, you know, he's great for learning logic and things like that. I know Ben feels that way and knows that. But if you want to go back and study Aristotle, you know what Aristotle thought about women? He thought they were inferior, defective versions of men. That's not what God teaches us here. That women and men are equally valuable because God made each of us in his image. And that just because misogynists abuse the teachings of Christianity does not mean that the Bible is wrong on this point. Let's not allow the abuses of others to ruin a good design from God. So we'll move on from that. In the image of God, verse 26, God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." He created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. If you notice through the days of creation, one of the things that's important is that God makes things to bear seed after its kind. Right? So an apple tree bears apples, right? Things are made after their kind. But are human beings made after their kind? Here, they're made in the image and likeness of God. The model, the plan for which human beings are to replicate is God. And so when people talk about the image of God, most of the time theologians have described the image of God as relating to our spiritual dimension, our capacity for a relationship with God, our ability to reason morally, that thing in us that separates humanity from animals. No other creature is described in these terms. Humanity is set apart. They're valued, and they have a specific role in God's creation. One of the church fathers, one of the most significant and important church fathers, Irenaeus, is famously quoted, maybe over-translated, but quoted with this phrase, "The glory of God is man fully alive." Regardless of how good the quotation is, the point is really, really strong. That God is glorified in us when we are most fully what he wants us to be, which is human. That when we are fully human, that is, reflecting the image of God the way he wanted us to be, then God is most glorified. God doesn't want you to be God. He wants you to be the human he has made you. And so, what is the best picture of a human being? What is the fullest description of a human being? What is the best representation of the image of God in flesh but Jesus Christ? Here's what Paul tells us in Colossians 1 about Jesus. It says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross." In Jesus, we see the fullest picture of what it means to be human, made in the image of God. Now, Jesus is God and takes on flesh, so he is different than us, but in his humanity, he is the best picture of what our lives should look like as humans. That the way of Jesus is the way to our fullest humanity. The path of Jesus is the path to our most fulfilled life. The character of Jesus is the beacon against which all other human character compares. That Jesus provides us the ability to see what the image of God really is. But because every one of us is made in the image of God, every human being, that means this, that every human being is equally valuable. You're not valuable because of your external beauty or your accomplishments or your pedigree, but because God made you in his image. Every one of us is equally made in the image of God. See, what we tend to do is we tend to judge people based on their usefulness. Well, this person has more money, so they must be more important. We see that in the book of James. That's not true in the church. There's no amount of money that makes you more valuable. In fact, as one theologian says, the face of a child with Down syndrome is equally as beautiful as an airbrushed supermodel on the cover of a fashion magazine. That means that the soul of the worst criminal is equally as valuable as the most outstanding citizen. That means that we value equally every single person, or should value equally every single person, whether they're an unborn baby or a bedridden elderly person. All are valuable. And so when we cease or refuse to recognize God's image in people we don't like, or people we don't understand, or people we don't see how they fit into our life, then we cease to or refuse to recognize God as God. We have to take all human beings infinitely seriously. And so I'm just going to jump right into it. This is where the preaching comes into meddling, because we are in a cultural situation that is discussing this very issue. You know, if you have any social media at all, if you watch any of the news, then you are confronted with this question of Black Lives Matter. Now, this should not be complicated, that we affirm that Black Lives Matter. That is not a political statement. That is not we're not aligning ourselves with an organization. We are saying just a basic truth that every person is valuable, and because Black lives have been consistently not valued in our country, and unfortunately the church has joined into the devaluing of Black lives, we can say without apology that Black lives matter. And in fact, Black lives don't just matter, Black lives are valued. They are cherished. They are loved. That if you walk down the street in our neighborhood, you are going to see a lot of Black people, and every one of them is made in the image of God. In the church, unfortunately, for many segments of the church, unfortunately, for many parts of our history, has not been clear about that. And so we're trying to play catch up. And unfortunately, the culture sometimes has shamed us into having to say things that we should have said a long time ago. But we don't determine anyone's value merely by their external circumstance. Jesus helps us to see the intrinsic dignity of each person as an image bearer of Christ, regardless of their money, their nationality, ethnicity, ability, disability, or any other factor. Now, sin, which has not entered our story yet, I'm going to leave that for Pastor James to teach. Let him bring you guys the bad news in a couple weeks. Sin, we know, though, is going to mess with this. Sin is going to hurt this. The image of God is going to be marred in humanity. It is going to be distorted in humanity, but it remains nonetheless. We see even in the story of Noah later on, even in the story later on, it says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his image." So even when sin enters the world, even when we are not living up to the potential for which God has called us to, every person is still valuable because they're made in God's image. But it doesn't stop there. Spider-Man, as Uncle Ben reminds us in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. God has not only made us in his image, humanity is blessed as God's earthly representatives. So God makes us in his image, but look at verse 26, it says, "Let them have dominion." Verse 28, it says, God blessed them. He said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion." He gives us plants to eat. He calls us to take ownership and stewardship of his creation. As God's image bearers, we have the privilege to serve as God's representatives in creation. I think we need to bring back this word. I couldn't find another word for this. I wanted to put it in the main point. My wife said don't, so I didn't, but now I'm just going to tell you that word, and that word is vice-regent. We need the word vice-regent. So regent, king, that's the person in charge. We need this other word because we're not talking about God's kingship. We're talking about us as representative of his kingship. A vice-regent is a deputy regent, a person who acts in the place of a ruler, governor, or sovereign. That God has given us the opportunity, the responsibility of exercising his dominion in the world. This is our stewardship of all that he's created. So when we're made in the image and likeness of God, that means he's also enabling us to fulfill this responsibility of enacting his rule and reign in this world. One way to think of the image of God is to think of it as a picture of his residence. That wherever the image of God goes, his seal is on that place. So when an ambassador goes from the United States to another country, they're going as an official representative of our country. We are called, we know as new creatures in Christ, to be ambassadors. That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5. He says, therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. God making his appeal through us. So the more we reflect Jesus, the more we display the image of God, the more we show people who God is in this creation. And there's a blessing that's in this creation. Now, you might have gotten hung up on this command, be fruitful and multiply. I've heard one professor say this is the one command that humans have obeyed of God. Right? That doesn't seem to be a problem for us to be fruitful and multiply. Of course, sin has made it hard. There are plenty of people who struggle with infertility and all that sort of stuff. But in general, people are not struggling to want to be fruitful and multiply. But this is not some call to like a procreational arms race. There's been a lot of talk about and this passage talks a lot about culture, but there's been a lot of talk about a culture war that we're in. Let me just tell you, we're in a war. We're not in a war with culture. We're in a war with principalities and powers. We are coming to bring God's culture to this sin-stained earth, but we are not at war with our culture. And we are not trying to merely outbreed them. We are blessed to fill the world with God's presence. We are blessed to steward creation to demonstrate the glory of God. It is good, and we should fill the world with children. If you are married and you do not want to obey this command, if you selfishly want to avoid this, I don't think that's healthy. But I also don't think it means you need 18 kids and counting. It's a blessing to fill the earth, not merely just a command to have a lot of kids. Because what good is it to fill the world with children if we don't steward the world to demonstrate God's glory? See, God created humanity with a task. Theologians call this the cultural mandate, a command to spread the glory of God by creating within his creation. Like he fashioned creation into an inhabitable place, we are to fashion creation, to create within it, to use what he's given us to display his dominion. We have a purpose as God's image bearers to fill the earth with his glory. So the way I've boiled this down as I think about this is when it really comes down to it, and we're going to tease this out in the weeks to come, but when it really comes down to it, my purpose is to proclaim and display the glory of God through all I do in all the earth. My purpose is to proclaim and display the glory of God through all I do in all the earth. How do I obey God and display his glory? That I take the fruit of his creation and I cultivate it as an act of love and worship to him. That means every aspect of my life is an opportunity to display the glory of God. One writer puts it this way: Jesus' lordship is as wide as creation, and if his lordship is as wide as creation, then the Christian mission is as wide as creation. Yes, our words and our behavior are essential. We must go and tell. They're essential to proclaiming and displaying the glory of God. But it is not just left to professional missionaries and pastors. All of us are called to be a part of displaying and proclaiming the glory of God. In our jobs, in our relationships, in our skills, in our hobbies. God has created us, designed us to be creative image bearers who use our gifts to magnify him. And so because you're made in the image of God, because you are created for the purpose of displaying and proclaiming the glory of God, you and I will never find our place in life until we found ourselves in God. That he is the means and measure of all things, and that nothing fits in our life, nothing makes sense until we understand how it makes sense in his plan. And sin is constantly threatening this. Rather than reflect God, sin tempts us to reflect ourselves. Rather than steward creation, sin threatens or tries to trick us into abusing creation for our own ends. Rather than finding fulfillment in God's good design, we set ourselves up as God to do what is right in our own eyes. So rather than building up creation for God's glory, we tear it down for our own ends. Rather than multiplication and filling, sin makes things barren and empty. But we'll see over and over again, we'll see this again in the covenant with Abraham, that God wants to bless and multiply through his people. That just like he put Adam and Eve in the garden to multiply, to fill, to worship and serve, he's going to say to Abraham, I'm going to make you a nation, and I'm going to bless you like I blessed them, to fill and multiply. And that we get to be a part of that promise, to fill and to multiply, to display God's glory in all the earth. One way that the Old Testament puts it, that the New Testament says as well, is this: be holy as I am holy. That God created us to reflect his holiness in creation. And so when the church comes around and acts, what happens with the church? They multiply. There's this new creation starting to come about in this broken world. That the church gets to reflect the generous creativity of God in the midst of a broken world. That we get to image God by walking in the path of the perfect image of God, Jesus. So the question I have for you is simply this: how can you display and proclaim the glory of God in your life? How can you display and proclaim the glory of God in your life? What words, what actions, what activities, what relationships? What attitudes, what plans, what emotions, all of it fits into the opportunity to fill the earth to display God's glory. And when we see the glory of God, we are changed to be like Him.